Just let everyone in. We're giving a minute. So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. We welcome you all, particularly those of you joining far away or from early or late times. Thank you very much for joining today's EPI-WIN webinar. Today's topic is on preparing for responding to an influenza pandemic. What is the PIP framework? For those of you new to EPI-WIN, it stands for the WHO Health Emergencies Information Network for Epidemics. Our goal is to translate science and knowledge in accessible, understandable, and relevant ways for evidence-informed actions and decisions for health emergencies. The PIP framework, the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, which we call the PIP framework, is unique as the first and only global access and benefit sharing system for public health. Today, as we celebrate 15 years of its existence, you will hear about it from experts who have contributed deeply to shaping this amazing, innovative mechanism. To start this session, we have someone who's no stranger to you at all, Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, Acting Director of Epidemic and Pandemic Threat Management Department at WHO, who will provide the opening remarks. Then we have Ms. Anne Huvos, Team Lead for the PIP framework, and someone who's probably been involved in PIP since its very first draft. She'll provide an overview of what exactly PIP does and its achievements. Then we have three wonderful panelists with us. The panel discussion will be moderated by Kate Rowling, Technical Officer in the PIP Secretariat. And the panelists are Dr. Farida Al-Husani, CEO of the Global Institute for Disease Elimination and a member of the PIP Advisory Group. Dr. Gina Saman, Regional Emergencies Director for the WHO Western Pacific region, who also led the PIP Partnership Contribution implementation for many years. And finally, Dr. Hugo Lopez Gatell, who's the Responsable de Asuntos de Salud, Mexican Permanent Mission to the UN. This will be followed by a Q&A where all our experts will respond to your questions. Some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and afterwards the recording will be available from our website. The address will appear in the chat. This is also being live streamed on YouTube. We invite you, those of you who are part of the EPI-WIN family for some time know this. We love to learn about where you are, where you work from, where you're joining us from. So please post your name, location, and organization in the chat box. We also love to hear about your experiences and points of view. So please also share those in the chat. But if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A box. Because we can track it more easily. Finally, we love to hear from you. This is for all of us to learn together. So keep your comments constructive, positive, respectful, and related to the topic. Now, before we move on to Maria, we have a question for you. It's slido.com, hashtag 19843014. What is the goal of the WHO Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework? You have four options. A, to monitor seasonal influenza trends. B, to ensure sharing of influenza viruses with pandemic potential and equitable access to benefits such as vaccines and antivirals. To regulate international travel during pandemics. Or to fund national influenza vaccination campaigns. Yeah, for those of you who know the PIP framework, I think that's a no-brainer, but it's still nice to know what you think. So hashtag 19843014.
Supriya, you're mute if you're talking.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, I was just saying that we have about 121 respondents now. I think in the interest of time, we can share the results. And you are absolutely right. It is B, which is the answer for 87% of you, to ensure sharing of influenza viruses with pandemic potential and equitable access to benefits such as vaccines and antivirals. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Maria Van Kerkhoff. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Supriya. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this important webinar today. Special thank you to all of our panelists who are online. You're in for a real treat in going over what PIP actually is. 2025 was a very strange year, I have to say, for all of us. It had many highs, it had many lows, including for our organization, and I'm sure for the organizations that all of you work in and work with. The sudden and severe cuts to funding for public health have really impacted many organizations globally, many nations, and it's resulted in not only the loss of livelihoods, but the loss of lives. We see deprioritization of many important public health agendas, and there have been huge disruptions to health systems in many countries around the world. On a positive note, it was a real landmark year for those working in epidemic and pandemic preparedness. The WHO member states adopted the Pandemic Agreement, which was an incredible achievement by all member states working together. And they also amended the international health regulations, which entered into force last year. These successes, these true successes, highlight the importance of sustaining efforts to prepare for and to mitigate the ever-present threat posed by infectious diseases. In 2025, through our surveillance and epidemic intelligence platforms, WHO detected 1.2 million signals, assessed and verified about 500 threats, and supported countries to respond to 450 of those events. Many of these were infectious disease signals. Influenza, of course, is one of the known pathogens with pandemic potential. An influenza pandemic is a certainty. It's not a matter of if, but when. And as such, WHO prioritizes influenza pandemic preparedness. As you will learn today, or as will be reinforced today, the PIP framework was adopted by the World Health Assembly on the 24th of May, 2011. For 15 years, the PIP framework has been building influenza pandemic preparedness at a global level, at regional level, and at country level, all over the world. It is a mechanism that enables the timely sharing of influenza viruses with pandemic potential, the equitable access to vaccines and other pandemic products, and strengthen pandemic influenza preparedness through a whole of government and a whole of society approach. I'm encouraged by so many of the participants that have joined today and so many people and partners around the world that support PIP. In this webinar, you're going to learn about the only example that we have currently of an access and benefit sharing mechanism for public health. The PIP framework can provide a model for other pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential, and 15 years of PIP framework implementation have yielded many translatable learnings. They guide us as a global health community, and this continues to help us navigate in a changing world and anticipate the evolving dynamics of infectious diseases. Once again, thank you for joining this. I'm going to hand over to Anne Huvos, who I'm a big fan of. She's a person whose dedication, commitment, expertise, drive, energy have been at the forefront of the PIP framework, from the negotiations with member states to its adoption at the World Health Assembly, and now through 15 years of implementation. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do. I'm so grateful for the work that the team does in HQ, in the regions, in countries, in support of pandemic preparedness worldwide, which has not only benefited influenza, but it has benefited pandemic preparedness as a whole across all different types of infectious diseases. So thank you so much for all of you for joining. Thank you to the panelists. Anne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Supriya. Thank you, Maria, for your kind words. And really just a huge thanks to all of you who've joined us today for this webinar. I mean, we're really humbled. I see 516 participants. Amazing. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the PIP framework. This is the international instrument negotiated by WHO's 194 member states from 2007 to 11, and that was adopted, as Maria said, by the Health Assembly in 2011. I hope I'll be able to convey the foresight and the strategic genius of those 194 member states when they designed what I think is an unparalleled system that has strengthened public health security in two ways, providing a mechanism to strengthen pandemic preparedness and response capacities now, and putting in place guaranteed access by WHO to future pandemic response products such as vaccines, so there's greater equity when the next influenza pandemic strikes. So next slide, please. So just a few background facts. As I think has been mentioned, influenza has been and it remains one of the world's most deadly infectious diseases. Seasonal flu kills 290 to 650,000 people every year, and it's estimated that influenza pandemics have killed upwards of 52 million people in the last century. Another important fact is that since the mid-1940s, flu vaccines have been around to address this seasonal disease, and the capacity to produce these vaccines is really key to preparing for pandemic influenza. Now, given the importance of influenza to public health, WHO has a dedicated global influenza program headed by Dr. Wenqing Zhang, and it coordinates an extraordinary network called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System, or GISRIS. This is a network of about 150 public health labs specialized in flu and located in about 130 countries of the world. It's been in operation since the early 50s, and it provides the world with three basic things: invaluable information analyses, risk assessments, materials such as candidate vaccine viruses and reagents, and then capacity strengthening through various trainings and quality assessment programs. It's through GISRIS that the world has such a strong influenza surveillance and laboratory capacity at the country level, and it is GISRIS that underpins the PIP framework. Next slide, please. So, what is the PIP framework? Well, it's a public health access and benefit sharing system. The negotiations for this system started at the time of the reemergence of avian influenza, AH5N1, or bird flu as it was called, in the early 2000s. And these negotiations were triggered by developing countries that were most affected by the reemergence of bird flu, but they couldn't get access to pandemic vaccines that were in development. So a number of years later, the negotiations resulted in the text that we have now before us, and it brings together member states, industry, civil society, international partners, and WHO to implement on an equal footing two equally important objectives: virus sharing, which is about the timely sharing with GISRIS of influenza viruses with pandemic potential, or IVPPs, and benefit sharing, which is about ensuring more equitable access to pandemic response products such as vaccines. Next slide, please. So how does it all work? Countries share their IVPPs with GISRIS. GISRIS conducts a host of analyses and assessments, and it recommends what strains should be in vaccines, and it develops the candidate vaccine viruses that are used by manufacturers to develop vaccines and other products. So manufacturers use all of the GISRIS information and products in their product development. In return, through the PIP framework benefit sharing mechanisms, countries have access to all of the information that is generated. They have access to funds for capacity strengthening, and at the time of a pandemic, based on public health risk and need, many countries will receive vaccines and other supplies secured by WHO through what is called standard material transfer agreements, which are advanced supply agreements. one of the key benefit sharing mechanisms of the PIP framework. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the benefit sharing under the PIP framework. There are really two key principal benefit sharing mechanisms. The standard material transfer agreements, or SMTA2s. These are legally binding advanced supply contracts that ensure WHO will have access to specific percentages of future pandemic product production, such as vaccines and antivirals, as and when they are produced at the time of a pandemic. WHO will distribute these for free to countries based on public health risk and need. The contracts that are signed by non-GISRIS entities that receive physical PIP biological materials. And these agreements are signed once, but they're regularly reviewed to make sure everything's in order. So that's for the future. And the other mechanism is for the here and now. It's called the partnership contribution, which is funding that is received every year by WHO from manufacturers that use GISRIS. Most of the funds are used by WHO now to strengthen pandemic readiness in countries where capacities are weak, and a proportion is reserved for future pandemic response. Together, these two mechanisms ensure that preparedness capacities are strengthened now and that equitable access to pandemic response products is in place for when they are needed. Next slide, please. A little bit more about the partnership contribution and how the funds are allocated. So the total amount expected to be received from manufacturers every year is 33.7 million. The amounts that are received are divided as follows. So 90% is allocated to preparedness and response, and of that 90%, 70% goes to pandemic influenza preparedness activities. These are activities that are outlined in high-level multi-year implementation plans. Activities include a variety of different things, but just to mention three: lab and surveillance capacity strengthening, regulatory capacity strengthening, and risk communications and community engagement. Another 30%, the other 30% of that 90 is held in reserve by WHO for a future pandemic, so that funds are available to WHO when pandemic influenza strikes. The PIP advisory group, which you'll hear about a little later, has developed guiding principles that will be used by the DG to steer the use of those response funds. And then 10% goes to support the PIP Secretariat operations. Next slide, please. So what have we secured to date? What have we done in the last 15 years? Well, through the SMTA2s, we've secured access to an estimated 900 million doses of vaccine. This represents about 11% of global production of vaccines in the first year. We've secured access to 25 million syringes, up to 5 million antiviral treatment courses, and 250,000 diagnostic kits. We've also secured access to some interpandemic vaccines, and those are also part of what we do. On the partnership contribution side, through the steadfast support of industry partners, we've collected approximately $350 million US, and about 214 million of those have been implemented. As I said, some are reserved for response. 86 countries have been supported, and work is really carried out across the three levels of WHO: country, regional, and HQ global. Progress on implementation is documented every 6 months using a monitoring and evaluation framework, and all the reports are published on the PIP webpage. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick snapshot of the broad range of implementation partners and their key roles in implementation. I won't read it through. You can look at it when you're done, but it really does it is key to remember we have member states, GISRIS labs, industry, civil society organizations, and other development partners that work alongside us to provide support in the implementation of the framework. Next slide, please. And finally, the last key component of the PIP framework is its robust three-pillared governance mechanism. This is a very important part of the framework, and when member states were negotiating, they were keen to ensure robust and strong oversight. So the World Health Assembly oversees overall implementation. The WHO Director General promotes implementation, carries out implementation, receives strategic advice from the advisory group, and regularly reports to the Health Assembly. And the third pillar is the PIP Advisory Group. These are 18 experts drawn from the 6 WHO regions. Each expert serves in his or her personal capacity, and the AG monitors implementation of the framework, and they report to the Director General every time they meet. They meet twice a year, and they provide evidence-based recommendations to strengthen the functioning of the framework. Next slide, please. And so with that, we've come to the end of our little overview here, but I hope you have a better sense of what the PIP framework is, how it works, and with whom. And before closing, I think I have two final thoughts. The first is that the success of the PIP framework over the past 15 years is a reflection of the trust among the many implementing partners and their staunch support of the objectives that underpin PIP, health security and equity. And the second is that I really wish to thank all PIP partners far and wide. PIP is the world's collective success story and a model for how WHO can leverage partnerships to improve public health with equity as the driver, the principle, and the outcome. It's been 16 years since the last influenza pandemic, and thanks to all of you, we're slowly getting better prepared for the next one, which will come. That's a certainty. Only the timing is unknown. So with that, let me turn the floor to Kate Rawlings, who will moderate the next part of the webinar with a panel of very distinguished experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for that great introduction to the PIP framework and how it works. It is now my absolute great pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists today, each of whom will draw on their experiences to provide us with unique insights on the PIP framework and its 15 years of implementation. So today with me, I have Dr. Hugo Lopez-Gatell, the Minister and Head of Health Affairs at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN office in Geneva. He is a medical doctor and epidemiologist by background and has held multiple public health positions within the Mexican government, including as the first national focal point for the IHR. I also have Dr. Farida Al-Husani, the CEO of the Global Institute for Disease Elimination, GLIDE, which is based in the UAE. And prior to this, she played a foundational role in establishing the Abu Dhabi Public Health Center, where she was the Executive Director for Infectious Diseases. She has also been the chair of the PIP Advisory Group for the past 2 years, and so is deeply aware of the intricacies of the PIP framework. And finally, Dr. Gina Saman, who is the Regional Emergencies Director of the WHO Western Pacific region. She is an epidemiologist by background and deeply familiar with influenza and the PIP framework, having previously been the team lead for the partnership contribution within the PEP Secretariat and instigator of both the high-level implementation plan 2 and 3. It is an absolute joy to have them here today. And I will now turn to you each with some questions to gather your thoughts and understanding and reflections on the PIP framework from the past 15 years. So my first question is to Hugo. In a world where multilateralism is being questioned and there is diminishing trust between nations, the PIP framework represents a successful example of multilateral collective action to achieve public health objectives. Would you agree with this statement? And if so, what do you think has made it successful?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to Anne and to the WHO Secretariat for inviting me to this important panel. My strong and definite response is I do agree with that statement. I definitely believe the PIP framework has been a central element to promote a good balance between essential capacities and also access to pathogens, in this case influenza, as well as on an equal footing benefit sharing and development of capacities in the member states. I could say that the way it has achieved that is based on PIP framework being a space for convergence to promote and protect health as a global public good, which I think is a fundamental contribution, as well as cultivating trust as a core value of multilateralism, which is also the fundamental aspect of its capacity. To show the case, I would just briefly mention 7 elements that are particular contributions of the PIP framework that in turn, according to my perspective, could serve as a good model, as a good example for concurrent or new initiatives, new challenges that we face in the realm of global public health in infectious diseases. So PIP framework is a model of legal certainty and transparent rules of engagement, as it has allowed the interplay of entities that have different interests, member states as defenders and promoters of the general interest of the populations, the private sector, and of course, all sorts of professionals that work for particular matters that are relevant in technical aspects of this. Also, the PIP framework has provided a strong, a well-developed governance that goes from its legal structure into the particular driving of the system in daily basis. And by that, we are very thankful with all of you that have made PIP framework a reality. Also, and this is crucial, the PIP framework is one pristine example of how to put on an equal footing access and benefit sharing. We are all familiar with challenges and defies to this conception that have in turn allowed the system to evolve into new manners to assure that equal footing representation. Also, it provides a structure framework for capacity building with stable funding streams, as identifying what are the key elements for capacity development in member states, in the region, and in the global system in order to be better prepared for a new influenza pandemic. In turn, also the PIP framework has made a very intelligent use of an ancient tool which is up to date and is functional every day, which is the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. Regardless of its long-term establishment, it has been renovated and updated with new technology, new intelligence use of the information, and new ways to converting data into knowledge, and in turn advice for specific purposes, such as development of vaccines and potentially therapeutics. Finally, but not less important, it has provided accountability and transparency. The way it has been structured with this 3-pillar governance that Anne referred to allows all member states and all interested parties to really access to how it works, how the funding is being used, and how capacity is being developed across regions and across the globe. The final thing I'd like to highlight is that the model of standardized contracts for material transfer is really something that has helped an open connection, an open understanding between parties with different interests. By binding private entities into both benefiting from the PIP framework as well as being obliged to share benefits that are relevant for pandemic preparedness in the case of influenza, has set a mechanism that is legally clear, legally traceable, and allows everybody to commit to a common effort and a common endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your incredibly insightful and reflective answer to those points. And so taking a step maybe from the broader picture on PIP framework as a framework, as an instrument, and delving a little bit more into some of the details and some of the implications of it on the ground, I turn to Dr. Farida and ask, despite the lasting impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the knowledge that a pandemic caused by an influenza virus is ongoing, the threat caused by an influenza virus is ongoing, it's been difficult to keep pandemic preparedness as a national and global health priority in many parts of the world. How can the PIP framework be seen as an example of how to ensure sustained focus on a public health topic? And how has its predictable fund impacted pandemic preparedness at a national level?
Thank you, Kate, for this introduction and for this really very important question. I'm very delighted to be part of this esteemed panel celebrating 15 years of achievement for the PIP framework. I would say it's really 15 years of investment in the influenza preparedness efforts at the global scale, trying to reduce its vulnerabilities, especially dealing with any future pandemic. To fully appreciate what PIP framework represents, I would say that we need to step back and look at the broader global health financing architecture, because the picture is deeply imbalanced. Historically, the majority of global health emergency funds go to the reactive part after the crisis have been already started, when lives are already lost and economies are already affected. Studies have consistently shown that for every dollar spent in pandemic preparedness, many multiplies more as spent on emergency response. The COVID pandemic alone cost the global economy an estimated tens of trillions of dollars. Yet, despite that lesson, preparedness remains chronically underfunded in the national budgets and also in the international financing mechanism alike. Global health architecture that is structurally oriented towards putting out fires rather than preventing them. That pays the price every time new threat emerges. Against that backdrop, the PIP framework and the partnership contribution, is a rare and deliberate exception example for a mechanism that is specifically designed to flow money into preparedness before a crisis, in addition to securing some resources to the resources that will be required during the pandemic, consistently year by year, and governed by a multi-year plan in a focus for the countries that have the majority of the gaps, and defining priorities both based on a global strategy for the influenza pandemic. It's really, really very rare and very successful model to be adapted. And it really, the uniqueness of that model is that it doesn't wait for the pandemic to unlock its resources. It's really one of the, would say it builds systems that make pandemic less catastrophic. And it does that quietly, persistently, and equitably, even when the world is not watching. As the PIP framework completes or marks its 15 years, it offers a working answer, not just to how to sustain the focus, but also on how to do so in a way that actively works to close the existing gaps at the global health level. And what makes it really durable, I would say, as someone who has been inside the governance of PIP as part of the advisory group, that it's really converted the shared threat, which is the influenza pandemic, into a legally binding system of mutual interest. Countries as they share the viruses, as Anne showed us the overall framework. They share the viruses with pandemic potential. In return, they received a guaranteed access to vaccines and countermeasure during pandemic, and they also received some support to strengthen their capacity and prepare for future pandemic. And just to reiterate on some of the figures mentioned by Anne, it's really successful because you can see this success and measure it in numbers, securing over 900 million doses of influenza vaccine and up to 5 million of antiviral treatment courses and around, I think, 250,000 of diagnostic kits. For countries with fragile health systems and with limited purchasing power, that legal guarantee is the difference between access versus nothing. What it looks like in the ground when we look at the impact of the PIP framework, we see people trained, labs built, and countries connected. And we can measure that as we see in every year the outcome reports that comes and shows how much has been achieved so far. And as a result, there are around, I think, 50% of all global member states have been participating in sharing the samples, at least one with the global collaborating centers, as per the report in 2014. Just to answer your second part of the question, which is related to the partnership contribution, we could see that it's really supported around 86 countries across the 6 WHO region, which is really concrete investments in exactly areas that matters the most in building lab capacities, in strengthening epidemiological surveillance, in regulatory strengthening and risk communication, and also pandemic preparedness. And critically, as we also saw during COVID, those investments were not only a single use and for influenza only. Those labs and surveillance systems strengthened through PIP Fund for influenza were very helpful for countries during the COVID detection and response period during the pandemic in 2020, especially for lower and middle income countries. The PIP partnership contribution may be the only predictable international funding that they receive specifically for many years. So it's kind of expected funds for at least 3 years when they get the grant. So just to end with one message I would like to leave you with, which is especially for the national policy makers who are with us in the room today and for leaders at the national level. The PIP framework is not just a funding mechanism. It is really an argument of what sustainable pandemic preparedness financing should look like globally. Predictable, with multi-year funding, equitable, and really tied to accountability that can be measured. The PIP framework has shown us how to institutionalize the commitment and deliver tangible results every year, build the kind of national ownership that outlasts. This is the blueprint. Our challenge now is how to build on that and expand it beyond influenza. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farida, for your thoughts on the matter and a really important message for us to all take away at the end around how the sustainable funding supports increased national ownership in such an important area, and how we can break this cycle of retrospective funding or firefighting in this emergency response mentality and make sure that we have stronger communities all together. I will now turn to Dr. Gina Saman for a question building on this, thinking about this global to local impact of the PIP framework. So PIP is a global access and benefit sharing system aiming to promote virus sharing and ensure countries receive benefits in return for sharing these viruses. Based on your experience working for the WHO, both having led the partnership contribution and in your current position as Regional Emergencies Director, can you describe how the PIP framework achieves global to local impact, including some of the successes and any ongoing challenges?
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. I have to say, I want you to take a moment and think in your own careers when you've worked on a project, a study, a program where you felt deeply proud and privileged to be part of that community, that body of work. Just take a moment and think about that. For me, this was the PIP framework. And I'm just so deeply privileged by being part of the PIP family. And when I say that, I mean the partnership, the stakeholders, and at the heart of it, countries who want to see better pandemic influenza preparedness. So, to everyone who on this call is a member of pandemic influenza preparedness, working day to day on getting us better prepared, give yourself a reaction, give yourself a thumbs up, give yourself a heart, because really we are a community working together. And I think where I want to start, Kate, with this question is about the gains that has been made in the 15 years of PIP. And it is staggering. Let me give you 3 examples. The first is 30% of the world's countries either started or strengthened their participation in the world's GISRs surveillance systems. And that means we now collectively have better risk assessments that are more robust, that are more comprehensive. And that means we're better prepared collectively. All countries, all partners can access better risk assessments. In another example is we've seen 25 additional countries in the 15 years establish national influenza centers, NICs. These are the eyes and ears of pandemic influenza preparedness. Why? Because they're constantly looking to detect new viruses and to help us monitor for changes. So that means we've seen a 19% increase in countries with national influenza centers in a 15-year period, bringing us to a total of 150 centers in over 130 countries. So that, again, huge gain. The needle has shifted. We have fewer blind spots, and that's really amazing. The third success I want to mention is global tools. You talked about global to local. So when we think about global, what do countries need from the global community? Countries need better tools, new innovations, new ways of work, networks that are stronger, networks that are fairer. And the last success I want to mention is how PIP supported that partnership contribution, supported a online training platform called Open WHO that ultimately had 34 influenza courses available for anyone at any time to access, and with over 180,000 takers of those courses, which is great for pandemic influenza preparedness. But also, what ended up happening is the world leveraged that for responses to other emergencies. So that platform had collateral benefit. And that countries love that. They want to have the synergies. They want to see efficiencies. They want to see tools that they can use in multiple ways. And during the COVID-19 pandemic alone, that platform was used by 6.5 million people to look at how to better respond and learn from the latest guidance and latest materials available globally. So you can see where I'm going with this. The success is collective. The success around this is achieved together. How do we get that success? It's partnerships. So we've got to really consistently acknowledge our partners, from countries to technical partners, to civil society, to industry partners who contribute that partnership contribution, $350 million, of which the majority has been used to strengthen capacities at all different types of systems and levels, bringing more equity. So that contribution and recognizing industry for that contribution is really critical. So I think at the heart of this is WHO coordinating, bringing countries together, bringing partners together, making sure that we're most efficiently and effectively strengthening our collective preparedness. Because at the end of the day, we are stronger together. We can have more tools as a result of these investments, ready for the next big pandemic. And it means that we are chipping away and making sure that there are more equitable systems globally. To the challenge, where are our challenges? I think the key one is that preparedness is never done. We consistently have staff turnover. We consistently have new technologies. We have new technical approaches, new methods. And so this means that preparedness is always ongoing, and we can keep striving to do more, better together. So I think we have a lot to celebrate, but really, let's also think ahead because we are in it together. Back to you.
Thank you, Gina, for those wonderful words and for giving that really detailed insight of just exactly some of the successes that PIP has had over the 15 years, but the work is not done yet. There is more as ever to do. So I'd like to thank all of my panelists for their deep, insightful knowledge on the different aspects of the PIP framework they've reflected to us here. Just to summarize a couple of my key takeaways from what they have just shared and how we can think about the past 15 years of the PIP framework and also how we can continue to go forward. We've heard about how PIP structurally breaks down the typical model of reactive funding when it comes to emergencies. And it promotes trust between all of the actors involved in the PIP framework and countries, showing that PIP at its core is a partnership. Yes, we may be sat here, in my case, from WHO talking to you about it, but it is not just WHO working on this. We are all collectively working on this, whether it's member states, whether it's laboratories, whether it's industry, civil society. We've all had a huge part to play in the benefits that have come through the PIP framework. The framework itself is providing legal certainty and clarity on the rules of engagement for all of this wide group of partners, and it's mutually beneficial for all of us, whichever sector, job, or group of people we are representing. And finally, that PIP has had so many successes on the ground in terms of promoting equity. You've heard several came from Anne in her presentation, and also Ugo, Farida, and Gina have all listed some in their presentations. And I encourage any of you that would like to look into more of these to visit the PIP website, where we have a whole host of reports, information, videos, just detailing a bit more about the work that has been done. But it is important that we don't forget the challenge that Gina just mentioned at the end. And it's such an important message that preparedness is never done. Whilst we are obviously overjoyed with the successes that have come out of the PIP framework over the past 15 years, we know that the work is ongoing, and we want to continue these gains as we move forward so that we can be in a better prepared, more equitable world. So I would just like to thank all of the panelists for their thoughts. And now to turn to some of the questions that have been submitted by our wonderful guests this afternoon. So I know some of my colleagues in the PIP team have already been answering a couple of them, a few of them online, but there are a few that we wanted to pose to the wider group. So this first question, I think I'll turn to Ugo first, but Gina and Frida, if you'd like to input as well, please do let me know. So the question from a member of the audience is, the PIP framework shares some similarities with the WHO pandemic agreement, especially related to access and sharing. Nonetheless, it took years to get the WHO pandemic agreement. Why do you think such a difficulty existed, even if examples like PIP were already in place?
Thank you for tossing that question specifically for me, as we are engaged into the negotiation of the PAP and PAP annex of the pandemic agreement, that in turn will be the key for either adopting or hopefully not this regarding the pandemic agreement in next World Health Assembly in May. Definitely certain delegations, or not quite a few delegations in the room that negotiates the PAPs, have scratched our heads and said, why don't we go and just use the model of PIP and converted it into the wider set of pathogens to convert it into the PAP system, or into the PAP system that helps the pandemic agreement. Certainly, we strongly believe it is an option to have it as a blueprint for how to develop the PAP's annex and the implementation of the pandemic agreement. We hold that very strongly. However, we must recognize that there are a few limitations, a few divergences between the PIP framework and what we need now for the pandemic agreement. One of those elements is that we would be dealing with all pathogens of pandemic potential, and not only influenza, as it is the case of PIP. And the uncertainties for everybody, for member states and governments to prepare, for industry to set up business models, for researchers to pursue research agendas and research and development agendas, would be very vast, would be a universe that is hard to encompass with a single solution. That is one of the reasons, perhaps the key solution. And the second one, which connects with the later, is also for influenza, we do have a predictability element, which is seasonal influenza. That provides business certainty for industry, that provides certainty, preparedness certainty for governments and for WHO and the regional offices. And a number of elements of predictability have helped building this capacity that is sustainable. It is hard to predict that can happen when we have a question mark on which pathogen would be the cause of the next pandemic. Nonetheless, my final message would be, as Gina had said, and Farida as well, based on the PIP framework, developments of capacity is the way many countries contained COVID pandemic. So what has been gained by the PIP can be converted into the roots, into the foundations of the implementation of the pandemic agreement, and we must pursue in that opportunity in the next few weeks as we close the negotiation of the PIP framework in preparation for the hopefully very successful adoption of the pandemic agreement in next Health Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ugo, and we are all incredibly excited and looking forward to that moment. It's been a momentous amount of work that has been going on over the past few years. We are running slightly short on time, so I just wanted to ask one final question from the audience to Gina and Farida, which looks at equity. Equity, of course, being a core and important part of the PIP framework. And so the question from the audience asks that during a crisis, a lot of focus, most focus, goes to high-income countries. And so when we look in terms practically where the focus goes, and the question is, how do we plan to fill this gap? How does, for example, something like the PIP framework work in this context? So I'm not sure who would like to provide their thoughts first. Perhaps I will go to Farida first and then to Gina. Farida.
Thank you, Kate. This is really a very important question. And we realize that, especially during pandemics, there are a lot of vulnerabilities in many countries, but most of the vulnerabilities is in low and middle income countries, simply because of their access to vaccines, to diagnostics and vaccines is very limited compared to other countries. And I think having the model that is really established as proactive commitment before pandemic happens is very important and very successful. So assuring that there are vaccines that are already committed by the manufacturers and not very much affected by the market negotiation during pandemic, which catastrophically happened during COVID-19. We saw that it's not working if you react rather than work on building a system that thinks proactively and designs the plan and the response plan that try to navigate the gap and bridge the gap, which is the inequitable access to vaccines, diagnostics, or antivirals. So I think this is what is the uniqueness of the PIP framework model is about, is thinking about preparedness, which is 70% of the investment or the funds goes to the preparedness, but the 30% of the framework that is focused on response is really targeting to bridge some of the gaps that are currently existing of inequity and difficulty to access vaccines for countries with limited purchasing power, with limited access to the market with high price during the pandemic.
Thank you very much. Gina, are there any points you would like to add?
Yeah, I think it's key to see that over 80 countries have directly benefited from the capacity building that's been invested through PIP. So better pandemic plans, more data to inform country risk assessments. If you cannot generate them, you have access to data. You have access to new guidance, new tools. So in that process, it means more countries, those with lower resources, are benefiting and are coming up to better strengthen systems that are ready for response. And I think that's key because in the gains made, in the needle shifting, we are helping and making sure that there is more equitable access. I think Farida's point is really critical. So only 0.3% of the world's COVID-19 vaccines available in the first 6 months. There were nearly 900 million doses available in the first 6 months of COVID vaccine. 0.3% went to low-resource countries. 0.3%. We heard from Anne that the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework has secured, Anne, was it 900 million? I can see her nodding. 900 million doses of vaccine. What does that mean? In real time, when the vaccines roll off those factory belts, some will go to those who've purchased them, and some will come to WHO to distribute them to those who cannot purchase them. The world will be very different. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And we're running close to the end of the session, so I would just once again like to thank all of my panelists this afternoon for sharing their thoughts and their wisdom on the PIP framework and helping us to celebrate both the 15 years of PIP, but also think about how we can continue using these gains, these learnings, and these experience to keep moving forward, both for PIP and more generally in the space of pandemic preparedness. And with that, I would like to hand back to Supriya to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate, for that excellent moderation. Thank you, Maria, for the welcome remarks and setting the scene. Thanks to Anne for giving that amazing overview. But most of all, thank you to all three panelists, giving very different but very interesting insights that really shape what the PIP framework is all about. But there are many more people behind the scenes who's been involved in this webinar. So I'd like to thank all of them. I have right next to me Jiang Feng, who's actually an old hand at EPI-WIN. We have Sarah Holderness, who started EPI-WIN during COVID. Then we have Michael and Armoral in the background managing the chat. We have Louisa and Jennifer and also Olga managing the Q&A. So they were reading your questions and helping to answer them. And we also have from Project ECHO, our collaborating center, Kanika, who's helping with sharing the slides and all the background work there. But most of all, I'd like to thank all the participants. You're the ones who make EPI-WIN webinars so interesting. The recording will be shared on our website very soon, as will be Anne's presentation, so you will have access to that. This webinar was also live streamed, so actually the live part will also be in the YouTube EPI-WIN if you want to consult that before that. And then I hope you'll join us again on 1st April at 2 p.m. for our next EPI-WIN webinar, which is an information briefing on influenza, SARS-CoV-2, and other respiratory viruses. And I will just put the link to that webinar on the chat here. I hope you will join us. And once again, thank you very, very much. Bye. See you next time.